Delaware is part of the Middle Colonies, which consisted of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware itself. Unlike the South's cash crops plantation system and New England's rocky soil that made agriculture difficult, the Middle Colonies were fertile. Land was given out easier, and the wheat and the corn from the farms would feed the colonies through America's colonial time. The climate in Delaware was well. It had a mild climate with warm summers and mild winters, which in turn helped for growing crops. Delaware is part of the Delmarva Peninsula. It is a large peninsula that is between the Delaware and Chesapeake Bay. Maryland and Virginia also occupy some part of the peninsula, but not as much as Delaware. The name Delmarva comes from a combination of all three names. A big part that most people know about Delaware is the river. What people don't know is that it was called something else. The Delaware River was called the South River by the Dutch and Swedish powers. The name Delaware came from when the English expelled the Dutch and took control of the New Netherland colony in 1664. The river was renamed Delaware after Sir Thomas West, 3rd Baron Delaware. Delaware had fertile land that was great for agriculture. The major agricultural industries included livestock, indigo, grain, wheat, and rice. Delaware was called the breadbasket colony along with its other middle colonies. The reason is that the middle colonies grew far more food than the southern and New England colonies. Since Delaware was in a central location, the middle colonies served as economic distribution centers in the English mercantile system. One of the most profitable industries of Delaware's colonial economy was shipbuilding. Dutch and Swedish immigrants built vessels for trade and personal use. The growth of the ship industry led to the growth in other industries. The most commonly grown foods were corn, flax, peas, beans, and beets. Grain was exported to other colonies by the way of the Delaware River. Not only did it produce food, they also manufactured iron ore products such as plows, tools, kettles, locks, nails, and large blocks of iron which they exported to England.
Before the English took over Delaware, there was conflict between the Dutch and the Swedish on who would take over Delaware. New Sweden Company secured land from the Native Americans, which would be called the New Sweden Territory. It was governed by Johan Bjornsson Prince. It wasn't much later that the Dutch would take over New Sweden, removing all Swedish influence from North America. The Dutch then would be taken out by the British in a series of wars between them. In 1664, England took over all of New Netherland and the Dutch possessions in the Delaware Valley. The Duke of York annexed Delaware, and it was governed by England as part of the colony of New York. James, the Duke of York, gave the northern part of Delaware to William Penn in 1682. William Penn, who then owned Pennsylvania, attempted to merge the governments of Pennsylvania and Delaware, but representatives from both sides clashed heavily and eventually two separate assemblies were to be held. Delaware was still under Pennsylvania's governor, and it wouldn't be until 1776 when Delaware would get its own government. Delaware was a proprietary colony, which is a government in which one or more proprietors were appointed land by the English crown to govern. The proprietor of Delaware was William Penn, who was awarded that position by King Charles II in 1682. Penn became responsible for the colony as proprietor, including leveling taxes, managing towns and cities, and monitoring religion. The Delaware Indians were known as the Lenni Lenape Indians and lived in Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Lenni Lenape Indians means original people. They were renamed Delaware by European settlers. They were divided into three groups: Munsee, Unalatigo, and Unami. They spoke different dialects of the Algonquian language. Their villages were located along the Delaware River. The Lenape practiced large-scale agriculture. They occupied campsites which gave them easy access to small game such as fish, birds, shellfish, and deer. They developed sophisticated techniques of hunting and managing their resources. The women cultivated the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. The men also practiced hunting and the harvesting of seafood. Another tribe that inhabited Delaware was the Nanticoke tribe. They were also Algonquian, and their traditional homelands were the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware. During their interactions with Europeans, the Lenape population fell sharply during this period due to high death rates of infectious diseases carried by Europeans. The first black ever recorded in Delaware Territory was Anthony, who who would be called Black Anthony, who was delivered to Fort Christina, a Swedish fort, and later served as a special assistant to Governor Bjornsson Prince. In 1721, about 500 slaves resided in the 3 lower counties of Delaware. Most of the slaves and free blacks worked as farm laborers or as domestic servants. In Kent County, successful planters owned large numbers of slaves. The socialization of blacks in Delaware was stated in the Act of 1700, entitled For the Trial of Negroes. This policy marked 150 years of discriminatory legislation to where blacks were given more severe penalties than whites for certain crimes, prohibited from carrying weapons or assembling in large numbers, and were subject to special court procedures. They were also prohibited voting, holding office, giving evidence against whites, and banning mixed marriages. The roles of colonial women were not equal to those of men. Their roles were determined by status, religion, and wealth. Therefore, they didn't have much choice on what they wanted to do. Especially in early colonial America, women were expected to help the men in any way they can in order to survive. Colonial women would marry early, and they usually bore large numbers of children because children meant more workers. Women were in short supply in colonial America, and thus had more value than the women in Europe. However, they were still not seen as equals by men, and they still had to give total respect to men. Women maintained household order in colonial society. They took care of young children, prepared food, directed the activities of servants or slaves, and performed chores. They also encouraged faith and moral development, as mothers being the primary spiritual instructors in the home. A woman's identity and property in colonial society was based around the men and their lives. When a woman is wed, her identity and property is then transferred to her husband.
Delaware had perhaps the most diverse beginnings, as the first settlements came from Scandinavians, Lutherans, Reformed Dutch, and later with infusions of English Quakers and Welsh Baptists. Over the 18th century, it became increasingly British with the arrival of the Church of England. When the Great Awakening began on October 30, 1739, at Lewes with the arrival of George Whitefield, an Anglican preacher involved in a movement that would eventually become the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church would eventually become the largest denomination in Delaware by the early 19th century.